The morning sun rose over the endless Wisconsin fields, spilling light over rows of corn, wheat, and hay. A young farm boy wiped sweat from his brow, his hands rough from work, his boots caked with mud. He wasn't thinking about war or glory or medals. He was thinking about the cows that needed milking, the tractor that wouldn't start, and the skies. Those wide blue skies that seemed to call his name. To most people, this was just another rural morning. To him, it was a dream waiting to take flight. His name was Richard Ira Bong, and he had no idea he was destined to become the greatest American fighter ace of all time. Out here, the world moved slow. The rhythm of life followed the seasons, the harvests, and the unpredictable moods of weather. Planes were something he saw only rarely, tracing white streaks across the sky. Each time one passed, young Richard would stop whatever he was doing, pitchfork in hand, shirt half-buttoned, and stare until it vanished beyond the horizon. He imagined what it would be like to be up there, high above the earth, defying gravity, free from fences and fields. Those moments planted the seeds of obsession. His parents were hard-working people, Scandinavian immigrants who valued humility and diligence above all else. The Bongs didn't raise dreamers, they raised workers. Richard, though, managed to be both. When he wasn't helping with chores, he was tinkering with engines, repairing old machinery, and building makeshift model planes out of wood and wire. His mother would shake her head as he stayed up late carving tiny propellers by lamplight. His father, half proud and half worried, would tell him, "You can't fly a plow, son." But even he couldn't suppress the spark in the boy's eyes. By the time Bong reached high school, the world was changing fast. News of conflicts in Europe and Asia made its way even to the quiet farmlands. The skies he had once gazed at with wonder now held a different meaning, one of machines built not for peace, but for war. Still, Richard's fascination didn't waver. If anything, it burned brighter. He joined a local flying club, taking lessons whenever he could afford them, sometimes working extra hours on the farm to pay for just a few minutes in the air. His instructor noted that he wasn't just talented, he was fearless. He learned to feel the aircraft, to sense its limits the way a pianist knows every key of his instrument. When America entered World War II, Bong was ready. He applied to the Army Air Corps, passed every test, and soon found himself in flight school, far from the green fields of Wisconsin. There, among the roar of engines and the scent of aviation fuel, he found his calling. His instructors described him as both brilliant and reckless, precise in his control, but daring in his instincts. He would push his plane to the edge, test its turns tighter than the manuals advised, and pull maneuvers that made his peers shake their heads. Yet he always landed smoothly with that same calm grin that seemed to say, "I told you so." It was during training that he began developing what others would later call the impossible trick. It wasn't something that could be taught. It was born from a combination of courage, intuition, and raw nerve. Most pilots engaged the enemy from several hundred yards away. Firing from too close was suicide. It gave the opponent no room to miss you. But Bong thought differently. He realized that the best way to make every bullet count was to get dangerously close, so close that you could almost see the rivets on the enemy plane. He trained himself to hold his fire until he was within just 300 feet, sometimes less. It was insane. But it worked. Instructors scolded him for taking such risks. They told him that kind of flying was a death sentence. Bong only nodded politely, pretending to listen. He knew something they didn't. He understood that air combat wasn't just about skill, it was about nerve. The pilot who flinched first, who hesitated, was the one who died. His trick was simple: don't flinch. When he graduated, he was assigned to the Pacific Theater, where Japan's Zero fighters ruled the skies. The odds were brutal. The Zero was agile, fast, and deadly in dogfights. American pilots called it a ghost, appearing from nowhere, striking hard, then vanishing into the clouds. Many didn't come back from their first missions, but Bong was not like most pilots. He had the patience of a farmer, the mechanical sense of a tinkerer, and the instincts of a predator. His aircraft was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, a twin-boomed, twin-engine fighter unlike anything else in the sky. Sleek, fast, and heavily armed, it was both beautiful and deadly. Bong fell in love with it instantly. He named his plane after his sweetheart back home, Marjorie Ann, and began flying missions with quiet confidence. He studied the enemy patterns, learned their maneuvers, and soon began applying his impossible trick in real combat. The first time he used it, even his squad mates couldn't believe it. A formation of Japanese Zeros appeared suddenly from the sun, diving straight at them. While others broke formation, Bong did the opposite. He turned toward them. Flying head-on, he closed the distance in seconds, waiting until the enemy filled his sights. Then, in one perfectly timed burst, he shredded the lead plane before the others even realized what was happening. He banked sharply, evaded a hail of gunfire, looped behind another Zero, and fired again. 2 kills in less than a minute. When he landed, his hands were shaking, but not from fear, from exhilaration. Word spread quickly. The farm boy from Wisconsin had pulled off what pilots called suicidal, and survived. Commanders began to take notice. They sent him on more missions, and with each one, his legend grew. He wasn't reckless. He was deliberate. He used the P-38's power to climb faster, turn sharper, and dive harder than the enemy expected. Each fight became a chess match in the sky, one he almost always won. But behind the glory was danger. Every mission meant gambling with death. His trick depended on precision, and even a fraction of a second's mistake could mean disaster. Sometimes after landing, his crew would find bullet holes in his wings or oil leaking from a punctured line. Yet Bong shrugged it off. Close, he'd say, but not close enough. In the Pacific heat, surrounded by jungle airstrips and endless tension, Bong began transforming from an ordinary pilot into something larger than life. His fellow airmen admired him. The Japanese feared him. Newspapers back home began printing his name. The boy who once chased clouds from a tractor seat was now carving his name into history, one dogfight at a time. And yet deep down, he remained that same farm boy, humble, quiet, and a little awkward. When reporters later asked him how he did it, he simply said, "I just got close and shot straight," as if destroying dozens of enemy planes was nothing more than hitting tin cans on a fence post. That humility only made him more legendary. By the time his tally began climbing into double digits, Bong had already outpaced most of his peers. He wasn't seeking fame. He was just doing his job, protecting his comrades, surviving another day, and perfecting his deadly dance in the skies. Still, each victory brought him closer to an unthinkable record. 40 enemy planes destroyed, each one brought down by the same boy who once dreamed of flying over the fields of Wisconsin. The Pacific airfields were harsh, makeshift strips of dirt carved out from jungle and coral, with tents flapping in the humid wind and engines roaring day and night. It was a world away from the peace of Wisconsin, but Richard Bong adapted to it as though he'd been born there. He didn't complain about the heat, the mosquitoes, or the food. He cared only for the missions, each one another chance to test his nerve and prove his method. He wasn't a glory seeker. He didn't care about the medals or the headlines that began to whisper his name. What drove him was something quieter and simpler, the challenge itself. Could a kid from a farm take on the empire of Japan's best pilots and win? By the time Bong entered full combat rotation, the Allies were struggling to regain air superiority over the Pacific. The Japanese Zero was still considered nearly unbeatable in one-on-one fights. Many American pilots feared it, calling it the killer in the clouds. But Bong didn't see it that way. He saw its weaknesses. He studied reports, asked mechanics for details, and even listened to captured enemy radio chatter when he could. The Zero was light and agile, but it wasn't armored. It couldn't take punishment. Its engine was fragile under pressure. Bong's P-38, on the other hand, could take hits and keep flying. It had two engines, twice the reliability, twice the thrust. Where the Zero relied on maneuverability, the Lightning relied on power. Bong knew that if he could outthink them, he could outfight them. His impossible trick evolved into an art form. While other pilots fired bursts from afar, Bong would close the gap until the enemy's plane filled his entire windscreen. He'd time his shots with deadly precision, using the P-38's nose-mounted machine guns to tear through the enemy's cockpit before they even had time to react. His discipline was uncanny. He never wasted ammunition, never panicked. He had the patience of a hunter waiting for the perfect shot, the instincts of a predator who knew when to strike. One mission became legendary among his peers. Bong and his wingman were escorting bombers over the island of Buna when they were ambushed by a swarm of Zeros. Radio chatter filled the air, warnings, cries for help, frantic calls. In seconds, the sky became chaos. Bong told his wingman to stay tight and climbed sharply, drawing the enemy upward. Then, in a maneuver that defied logic, he cut his throttle, flipped his plane inverted, and dove straight through the center of the attacking formation. The Zeros scattered, trying to follow, but his lightning was already behind them. He fired once. Down went one Zero. Another looped around, trying to get on his tail. Bong spun his plane in a rolling dive, reversed, and caught the second plane in his sights. Another short burst, another kill. The rest broke off and retreated. He landed with holes in his fuselage but a grin on his face. His ground crew said it looked like his plane had been stitched by machine gun fire. Bong just shrugged. "They missed," he said simply. Word of his heroics reached high command. Major General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, was so impressed that he personally congratulated Bong and nicknamed him Ace of Aces in the making. Kenney saw in him not only skill, but an attitude that inspired others. Bong wasn't just a killer. He was calm, modest, and devoted to his comrades. After missions, while others drank and bragged, he often sat quietly by the airstrip, cleaning his pistol or scribbling notes in a little pad. Calculations, gunnery angles, and thoughts about what he could do better next time. The war dragged on, mission after mission, and Bong's kill count continued to rise. He shot down his 5th enemy aircraft by mid-1943, making him an official ace. By the end of that year, his total had climbed to over 20. The number alone was astonishing, but what really stunned people was the consistency. Bong wasn't a lucky pilot. He was methodical. Every victory was earned through nerve, patience, and precision. Each time he went up, he carried with him the same quiet confidence he had when fixing a tractor on the farm. Study the problem, trust your hands, and finish the job. Not every mission was triumphant, though. Some ended in smoke and terror. Once, during a routine patrol, Bong's right engine was hit by enemy fire. The P-38 began to shake violently, oil spraying across the cockpit. Alarms blared. Any normal pilot would have bailed out, but Bong stayed in control, feathered the failing propeller, and coaxed the plane home on one engine. He landed with less than 10 gallons of fuel left and a smoking trail behind him. When a mechanic asked why he didn't eject, Bong replied, "I didn't want to lose the plane. She's gotten me this far." He formed bonds with his fellow pilots that were closer than family. They trusted him, followed his lead, and drew courage from his example. Many said flying beside Bong felt like having a guardian angel. He never abandoned a comrade, even when it meant breaking orders or risking his own life. Once, when his wingman's plane took a hit and began trailing smoke, Bong refused to return to base. He circled above, escorting his friend all the way down to a crash landing, covering him from enemy fighters the entire time. When they both made it back alive, Bong joked, "I just didn't want to fly alone." His fame grew. Newspapers in the U.S. started running headlines about America's farm boy ace. People back home sent him letters, photos, and even packages of Wisconsin cheese. But Bong stayed grounded, literally and figuratively. Whenever he was rotated back from the front lines for rest, he'd spend time with the new recruits, teaching them how to fly, how to survive, and, most importantly, how to keep calm under pressure. His advice was always the same. Get close. Don't spray and pray. Make your shots count, and don't ever let them scare you. By mid-1944, Bong's name had become synonymous with victory. He had downed 30 enemy aircraft and showed no signs of slowing down. His superiors began to worry. Losing him would be a devastating blow to morale. General Kenney tried to ground him, ordering him to train others instead of flying combat. But Bong resisted. He felt guilty sitting behind a desk while his friends were risking their lives. He'd sneak onto missions whenever he could, taking the P-38 out for a test flight that just happened to end in another dogfight. Each new victory added to the legend. He painted small Japanese flags on the nose of his plane, one for each kill. Soon there were so many that the mechanics had to shrink them to make room. His reputation spread even to the enemy. Japanese pilots were briefed to beware of the twin-tailed devil, the American ace who would appear out of nowhere and vanish just as quickly. Some even refused to engage when they saw a P-38 with Bong's markings. Despite his growing fame, he remained modest to the point of awkwardness. When asked how he felt about being America's top ace, he'd say, "Just lucky, I guess." When reporters pressed him for details about his tactics, he'd smile and deflect. "I just get close," he'd say again. "That's all there is to it." It wasn't false humility. He genuinely believed that anyone could do what he did if they were willing to take the same risks. Of course, few ever could. But war has a way of testing even the strongest. Bong began to feel the strain, physically and mentally. The Pacific heat, the endless missions, and the loss of friends weighed on him. He'd seen men vanish in fireballs, parachutes fail to open, planes spiral into the sea. Every time he took off, he knew it could be his last. Still, he kept flying, kept perfecting his craft. The farm boy who once watched planes from the ground was now the most feared man in the sky. Then came the mission that cemented his place in history. The weather was rough, visibility low, but intelligence reported a large formation of Japanese bombers heading toward Allied positions. Bong and his squadron were scrambled to intercept. As they climbed through the clouds, enemy fighters appeared to protect the bombers, dozens of them. Outnumbered, Bong made the split-second decision to dive straight into the formation. His guns roared, and one bomber exploded in flames. A Zero latched onto his tail, bullets ripping through the air. Bong pulled into a near-vertical climb, cut his engines briefly, and let gravity swing his plane into position behind the attacker. He fired a short burst, and the Zero disintegrated. In that single sortie, Bong claimed 3 more kills. When he landed, his crew counted bullet holes in his wings, over 50. His grin was the same as ever. That mission brought his total to 40 confirmed kills. No American pilot in World War II would ever surpass that number. Richard Bong had become the official ace of aces. Back home, his name was front-page news. He received the Medal of Honor from General Douglas MacArthur himself, who told him, "You have set an example for all of us." Bong, bashful as ever, simply saluted and said, "Thank you, sir." By the time the Medal of Honor was pinned to his chest, Richard Bong had already flown more missions than most pilots could count. He stood there in his crisp uniform, the applause of generals and officers echoing through the ceremony hall, yet his expression remained humble, almost embarrassed. The farm boy who once dreamed of flying had become a national icon, but in his heart, he was still just Dick Bong from Poplar, Wisconsin. He didn't crave the spotlight, he craved the sky. When the ceremony ended, reporters crowded him, snapping photographs and firing questions faster than machine gun rounds. "Captain Bong, how does it feel to be America's greatest ace?" one shouted. "What's your secret in combat?" asked another. Bong smiled politely, scratching the back of his neck. "I just try to get close," he said again. "And then I shoot straight." The reporters laughed, thinking he was being modest, but he wasn't joking. That was really it. Get close. Don't miss. After his Medal of Honor, the Army Air Corps officially grounded him from combat, fearing that losing their greatest ace would be a blow the American public couldn't bear. Bong protested, arguing that he was still fit and capable, but orders were orders. General Kenney told him plainly, "Dick, you've done enough. We need you alive." Bong reluctantly agreed, though it broke something inside him. Flying wasn't just his duty, it was his identity. The war still raged and his friends were dying, but he was being told to stand down. So he was reassigned to training duties. He became an instructor, teaching young pilots the art of survival in the air. The men he trained looked up to him as a living legend, yet Bong treated them as equals. He spent long hours explaining air combat tactics, walking them through diagrams, even sitting in the cockpit beside them to demonstrate maneuvers firsthand. "Don't chase them too long," he'd say. "Patience wins. They'll panic before you do." His students listened like disciples learning from a master, and in many ways, they were. Some of those men would later become aces themselves, carrying Bong's lessons into battle. Still, he couldn't resist temptation. Every so often, when the opportunity arose, Bong would find excuses to fly test missions or escort runs that just happened to put him in the thick of combat again. He couldn't help it. The call of the sky was too strong. Once, when Kenney caught wind that Bong had sneaked out on another unauthorized mission, he reprimanded him, half angry and half admiring. "Bong," he said, "if you weren't so damn good, I'd court-martial you." Bong just smiled. "Then I guess I'd better stay good, sir." Despite his unofficial combat hiatus, Bong's legend continued to grow. The U.S. media turned him into a symbol of hope and American ingenuity. He appeared on posters, in newspapers, and in radio broadcasts. People loved the story, a small-town farm boy who rose to become the deadliest pilot in the world. Children in rural towns pretended to be him, zooming toy planes through the air, shouting, "I'm Dick Bong." But fame sat uneasily on his shoulders. He didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a man doing his job. Between missions and training assignments, Bong wrote often to his fiancée, Marge Fattendall. She was a beautiful young woman he'd met before the war, and their correspondence became his refuge from the chaos. He named every one of his planes Marge and had her photograph painted on the nose of his P-38, a smiling face that became as iconic as the pilot himself. Every time he climbed into the cockpit, he'd tap that image like a good luck charm. His crewmates teased him about it, but he didn't care. Marge represented home, peace, and everything he hoped to return to once the war was done. When he finally did return to the States for good in late 1944, the welcome was overwhelming. Parades, interviews, ceremonies. It was all too much. Bong endured it with his usual shy grin, but those who knew him could see he felt out of place. Crowds cheered his name, yet he longed for the hum of engines, the roar of takeoff, the silence of the sky above the clouds. He was a hero. Yes, but heroes, he realized, don't always know what to do once the fight is over. Settling back into civilian life wasn't easy. The world felt smaller on the ground. He and Marge finally married in February 1945, a quiet ceremony surrounded by family and friends. For a few brief weeks, Bong tasted happiness untainted by war. The papers called it America's Sweetheart Wedding, and photos of the couple appeared in magazines nationwide. He was 24 years old, a national treasure, with his whole life ahead of him. Yet even then, part of him still lived up there in the clouds, chasing the horizon. As the war began to near its end, the United States was preparing to transition from propeller-driven fighters to jet aircraft. The new Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star was the pride of American aviation, a sleek, futuristic machine, unlike anything that had flown before. And naturally, the Army wanted its best pilot to test it. Bong was offered a position as a test pilot in California, helping to refine the aircraft that would define the next era of flight. It was a dream assignment, the perfect bridge between his wartime skill and peacetime passion. He accepted immediately. The work was dangerous, far more than most realized. The early jet engines were unpredictable, prone to flameouts and mechanical failures. Test flights were as risky as combat, sometimes more so. But Bong wasn't the type to shy away from danger. He threw himself into the job, studying the new systems, flying experimental runs, and reporting every detail to engineers. He was meticulous, professional, and fearless, as always. The same calm determination that carried him through battle now guided him through the dawn of the jet age. By summer 1945, the end of the war was in sight. Japan was on the verge of surrender. The newspapers were filled with headlines of victory, atomic bombs, and celebration. America was ready to move on, to rebuild, to dream again. On August 6, 1945, Bong prepared for another routine test flight out of Burbank, California. It was a bright morning, the sky perfectly clear. He kissed Marge goodbye, promised her he'd be home for dinner, and drove to the airfield. It was a day that would change history, for reasons no one could have imagined. That same morning, halfway across the world, the first atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. At almost the exact moment the news would soon shock the world, Richard Bong climbed into the cockpit of his P-80 Shooting Star for what should have been a simple acceptance flight, a check to verify the plane's systems before official delivery. The engine started normally, but as he lifted off, something went wrong. Witnesses saw the jet falter shortly after takeoff, its engine sputtering, smoke trailing behind. Bong tried to eject, but the altitude was too low. His parachute failed to deploy in time. The jet plunged into the ground, exploding in a ball of fire. Richard Bong, America's ace of aces, was gone, killed not in combat but in a peacetime test flight. He was only 24 years old. The nation was devastated. News of his death hit the same front pages that carried the story of Hiroshima. For a brief moment, amid the overwhelming triumph of victory, America stopped to mourn. President Truman himself sent condolences to the Bong family. Newspapers called it the cruelest irony of war's end. The man who had survived hundreds of battles, who had faced impossible odds and walked away each time, had fallen in the very moment peace returned to the world. Marge was inconsolable. She had been listening to the radio when the announcement came. The words blurred, the room spun, and her knees gave way. Friends and neighbors tried to comfort her, but nothing could fill the void. Just months before, they had been newlyweds, planning a future together. Now, she was a widow before her 25th birthday. Bong's parents back in Wisconsin received the telegram in silence. His father, the man who once told him, "You can't fly a plow," wept openly for the first time anyone could remember. The funeral drew thousands. Soldiers, pilots, civilians, all came to pay their respects. His coffin was draped in the American flag, carried by fellow airmen who had fought beside him. As taps played, the crowd stood in solemn silence. There were no grand speeches, no fanfare, just grief, pride, and the unshakable realization that true heroes often burn brightest before they're gone. In the years that followed, Richard Bong's name became legend. Schools, airfields, and highways were named in his honor. Statues were built, museums erected, books written. The Richard the Ver Bong Veterans Historical Center in Superior, Wisconsin, stands today as a living testament to his courage and character. Visitors walk past photos of a smiling young man in flight gear beside the P-38 that bore his fiance's name and realize that heroes can come from the most ordinary beginnings. His legacy isn't just about the 40 planes he destroyed or the medals he earned. It's about what he represented, the spirit of determination, humility, and bravery that defined a generation. He proved that greatness can come from anywhere, that even a farm boy from the fields of Wisconsin can change the course of history through sheer willpower and courage. Bong's story endures not because of how he died, but because of how he lived, fearlessly, humbly, and with unshakable purpose. His impossible trick wasn't just a flying maneuver, it was a mindset. Get close to your challenges, face them head on, don't flinch. And when the odds seem impossible, that's when heroes are born. In the months following Richard Bong's death, America was celebrating victory yet grieving its heroes. The war had ended, the world was exhaling, but the cost of peace was written in the faces of those left behind. Bong's name was etched into the national memory as both triumph and tragedy, a symbol of how the brightest flames often burn the fastest. To his friends, he was more than a legend. He was a kind, quiet man with a shy smile, a steady hand, and a heart that never wavered. His story was told again and again across airfields, classrooms, and dinner tables, becoming part of the mythology of World War II. But beneath the myth, there remained the soul of a humble farm boy whose dreams had carried him higher than anyone could have imagined. Back in Wisconsin, the Bong family received a flood of letters from all corners of the country. Fellow pilots wrote about how he'd saved their lives in combat. Strangers wrote about how his courage had inspired their sons to enlist. Children drew pictures of his P-38 Lightning and sent them with simple notes. "Thank you, Captain Bong." His mother Dora kept many of those letters in a small wooden chest, reading them whenever the pain of loss grew too heavy. She often said that Dick wasn't just her son anymore. He belonged to America. Marge, his widow, was invited to numerous memorial events, but she attended only a few. The spotlight felt hollow without him. She would later say that she preferred to remember him not as the war hero, but as the man who used to send her letters covered in doodles and jokes, the one who called her "my lucky charm." She kept the photograph he had painted on his plane's nose, that same smiling image that had flown with him through battle after battle, framed on her bedside table for the rest of her life. For the men who had served with Bong, his death was a blow that echoed through every airstrip in the Pacific. Many couldn't believe that the man who seemed invincible had fallen to a mechanical failure. It didn't feel right. They had seen him pull off the impossible time and again, dodging tracer fire, outmaneuvering squadrons, landing with one engine shot to pieces. And now he was gone because of an engine malfunction on a clear day. It was a cruel reminder that no matter how skilled or lucky a man was, fate had the final say. In military circles, Bong's tactics became a subject of study. His get-close philosophy was dissected in training manuals and flight schools for years to come. Instructors emphasized his precision, his patience, and his composure under pressure. One of his famous lines, "You can't miss if you don't shoot until you're sure," became a staple of aerial combat doctrine. Even decades later, fighter pilots across generations knew his name. The Air Force called him the ultimate example of calculated courage. But the real essence of Bong's greatness couldn't be reduced to tactics or statistics. It was Something deeper, a combination of humanity and nerve, of modesty and audacity. He didn't fight for fame, and he didn't see himself as extraordinary. He fought because it was his duty, because his friends were up there in danger, and because the job needed doing. That purity of purpose made him timeless. His legend wasn't born from self-promotion or propaganda, it was built from truth. The story of his impossible trick became a favorite among aviation enthusiasts. To some, it sounded like madness, waiting until the enemy filled your windscreen before firing. To Bong, it was simple physics and confidence. He once told a fellow pilot, "If you can see the oil on his fuselage, that's when you shoot." The idea seemed reckless, but it reflected the precision of his farming roots. Growing up, Bong had learned the importance of timing, when to sow, when to harvest, when to pull the plow. In the sky, it was no different. Every second mattered. Every movement counted. The same patience that helped him steer a tractor through muddy fields helped him line up perfect shots against agile enemy planes. The farm had taught him discipline. War had tested it. As peace settled across the world, Bong's story became a bridge between eras. The generation that had fought in World War II carried his name as a reminder of what they had achieved and sacrificed. For the generation that followed, he became a symbol of what was possible when courage met skill. His face appeared in comic books, history magazines, and recruitment posters. School children learned about him alongside other great heroes, Audie Murphy, George Patton, and the flag raisers of Iwo Jima. Yet for all his fame, Bong's image never carried arrogance. He remained the humble ace, the smiling farm boy who never thought himself above anyone else. In Superior, Wisconsin, a small airfield was renamed Bong Memorial Field. There, a bronze statue was erected, not of a warrior with a weapon, but of a pilot looking skyward, hands on his helmet, gaze fixed toward the horizon. Beneath it, an inscription reads, "He dared the impossible." Every year, on the anniversary of his death, veterans and civilians gather there to honor his memory. They tell stories, share laughter, and sometimes tears. Some are old enough to remember him. Others only know him through history. But all feel the same reverence, not just for the pilot, but for the man. Time, as it does, carried on. The world entered the jet age that Bong helped usher in. New wars arose, new heroes emerged, but his name endured, echoing through the halls of air bases and museums. For fighter pilots in particular, his example remained a benchmark, not because of the number 40 painted on his plane, but because of the fearlessness and clarity that defined every decision he made in the air. There's an oft-repeated story from his training days that captures his essence. During a gunnery exercise, an instructor scolded Bong for taking too long to engage a target. "Why didn't you fire sooner?" the man barked. Bong looked at him calmly and said, "Because I wasn't close enough." When the instructor argued that he'd risked missing his chance, Bong smiled faintly. "If I miss, the chance is gone anyway. I'd rather wait and make it count." That philosophy of patience, precision, and purpose followed him to the Pacific and became the difference between life and death. Those who knew him often described his demeanor as deceptively calm. Even in the heat of dogfights, when bullets sliced through the sky and planes exploded around him, Bong's voice over the radio remained steady, almost casual. "He flew like he was born in the cockpit," one of his squad mates said. You'd hear panic in everyone else's voice, but not his. He'd just say, "Hang on, I see him." And 30 seconds later, the enemy was gone. It wasn't bravado. It was pure focus. In many ways, Bong's story is also a story about America itself during that era. A nation of ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances who rose to the challenge through courage and conviction. His upbringing represented everything the country prided itself on: hard work, humility, faith, and a quiet confidence that no obstacle was too great. When he flew, he carried those values with him. Every pull of the trigger, every dive into enemy fire, was an extension of that same spirit. His death on the very day the atomic bomb fell over Japan remains one of history's most poignant coincidences. As the world transitioned from one age of warfare to another, from dogfights in the sky to weapons of unimaginable power, the era of pilots like Bong was coming to an end. In a way, his passing marked the close of the romantic age of air combat. No longer would wars be won by individual heroes dueling in the sky. The world was entering an age of machines and magnitude. Bong was the last of a kind, the pure fighter whose courage and skill alone could turn the tide of battle. Yet his memory continued to inspire. Decades later, Air Force cadets would still hear his name during training. Museums displayed his P-38, restored to gleaming silver, with Marge painted proudly on its nose. Visitors would stand before it, imagining the roar of its engines, the vibration of its guns, and the young man who once commanded it with such effortless mastery. Even those who had never known war could feel something stir, a mix of awe, sadness, and gratitude. Perhaps the most powerful part of Bong's legacy is the lesson it carries. His life teaches that greatness doesn't begin with privilege or power. It begins with passion, with a spark that refuses to be dimmed no matter how small or remote its origin. A boy from a farm, surrounded by fields and chores, looked up one day and decided he wanted to fly. He followed that dream with every ounce of strength he had. And though it led him into danger, it also led him into history. If Richard Bong could speak today, he might shrug off the hero worship. He'd probably smile that same quiet smile and say something simple like, "I just did my job." But that humility is exactly why his story endures. He didn't fight for recognition. He fought because it was right. And in doing so, he showed what ordinary people can accomplish when they believe in themselves and refuse to give in to fear. Even now, nearly 80 years later, pilots still whisper his name before takeoff. They look at his photo, at that grin beneath a flight helmet, and feel a little braver. They know that somewhere up there, in the blue vastness above the clouds, the spirit of a farm boy from Wisconsin still flies, steady, fearless, and free. Long before the legend of the Ace of Aces was sealed in medals and headlines, there was just a boy who could fix anything with his hands and never back down from a challenge. Those who knew young Richard Bong would later say that you could always tell he'd grow into someone special, though no one could have predicted how far that spark of curiosity and courage would take him. He wasn't a loud child. He wasn't boastful. He didn't demand attention. He earned it through quiet competence. On the farm, when the tractor broke down, he was the one who found the problem. When a fence collapsed, he built it better than before. When the skies above their Wisconsin fields thundered with passing planes, he didn't just look up. He memorized their shapes, their angles, their speed. His world was small, but his imagination was vast. That imagination carried him through his teenage years. He spent hours reading about flight, about the Wright brothers, Charles Lindbergh, and Amelia Earhart. He sketched aircraft in his notebooks, studied their wings, and dreamed of sitting behind a control stick. While other boys talked about sports or dances, Bong talked about engines and aerodynamics. Some classmates teased him, calling him Sky Boy. He'd only grin. "Maybe one day," he'd say. No one doubted his sincerity. It wasn't the boasting of a dreamer. It was the certainty of someone who already knew where he belonged. When he joined the civilian pilot training program in college, he finally touched the sky for the first time. The moment the plane lifted from the ground, everything else in his life fell away. The rumble of the engine, the pull of gravity, the rush of air. It all made sense to him. He wasn't nervous. He was home. His instructors quickly realized he was a natural. He handled the aircraft with instinctive grace, feeling its responses before instruments could confirm them. He wasn't the fastest learner in theory, but in practice, no one could match him. He had that rare blend of caution and daring, the patience to wait, and the nerve to act at exactly the right moment. When the war began, it was as if the sky itself had called his name. He enlisted without hesitation, driven not by hatred or vengeance, but by purpose. The thought of defending his country, of flying not just for himself, but for something greater, filled him with pride. Yet even in uniform, among the rows of eager recruits, Bong remained humble. He never bragged about his skills, never boasted about his future. He simply trained harder than anyone else, flying every hour he could, pushing himself to master every maneuver, every emergency procedure, every limitation of his aircraft. His instructors noticed his unusual approach to gunnery training. Most cadets fired bursts from distance, aiming for safety. Bong, on the other hand, closed in tight before pulling the trigger. When asked why, he gave a simple explanation. "You can't miss if you're close enough." It was both genius and madness, a rule that would later define his combat style and earn him the nickname One Pass Bong. In training exercises, his accuracy was unmatched. He rarely missed a target, and his efficiency with ammunition became legendary. He didn't waste a single bullet, one instructor recalled. He treated every shot like it was sacred. When Bong transitioned to the P-38 Lightning, it was as if man and machine had been made for each other. The twin engines gave the aircraft a distinctive look and a deadly performance. To the Japanese, it was known as the fork-tailed devil, and Bong would soon embody that name more completely than anyone. The P-38 was faster, more stable, and could fly higher than the nimble Zeros that dominated the Pacific. But it required finesse. Its power could overwhelm an inexperienced pilot, and its weight made it less forgiving. Bong, however, had the touch. He flew it with smooth precision, turning what others saw as a brute force machine into a graceful instrument of war. His first kill came during an escort mission, when his flight intercepted a formation of Japanese bombers over the jungle. Bong closed in far closer than his wingman dared. "You're too close, Dick," the man yelled over the radio. Bong didn't reply. He fired one short burst and the bomber erupted in flames. It fell like a comet, crashing through the trees below. His wingman, stunned, said later, "He made it look easy, like he was swatting a fly." But Bong knew it was anything but easy. Behind every victory was a balance between instinct and discipline, a razor's edge between control and chaos. As his victories accumulated, Bong began to develop a kind of rhythm in combat. He studied not only the enemy, but also the conditions: wind direction, sun position, cloud cover. He used every advantage. When Japanese pilots tried to lure him into turning battles, he refused, knowing the Zero's agility was unmatched in tight turns. Instead, he used the P-38's power to climb and dive, striking from above or below, where his twin engines could outpace any opponent. He turned the fight into a contest of strategy rather than reflex, and in doing so, he redefined what it meant to be a fighter ace. By early 1944, his reputation had grown beyond the Pacific theater. Military newspapers printed his name alongside headlines about Allied victories. He had become a symbol of American air superiority, the embodiment of courage, intelligence, and calm under pressure. Yet, when asked about his success, Bong deflected the praise. "I just try to bring my boys home," he'd say. "That's all." He saw his victories not as trophies, but as survival, his and his squadron's. He often downplayed his achievements in letters to Marge, writing, "I'm just lucky to still be in one piece. Tell everyone I'm fine and that I miss home." His sense of duty extended beyond personal glory. Bong was known for looking out for new pilots, often volunteering to fly wing for rookies on their first missions. "You fly my wing," he'd tell them. "Just stick close and don't panic." For many, that meant the difference between life and death. One pilot later said, "Flying beside Bong was like being covered by an invisible shield. He made you feel untouchable." That mentorship earned him respect not only from his peers, but from commanders who saw him as both a warrior and a teacher. Of course, even heroes face close calls. On one mission, his plane was riddled with bullets during a head-on attack. A slug tore through his canopy, grazing his helmet. The blast of air and sound was deafening. Bong didn't flinch. He simply adjusted his throttle, rolled into a dive, and kept fighting. When he landed, his mechanics found holes across the fuselage, the tail almost shredded. "You're lucky to be alive," one said. Bong smiled faintly. "Luck had nothing to do with it," he replied. "They just couldn't shoot straight." By the time his score reached 30, his commanders began to worry. They had seen too many heroes fall after pushing their luck too far. Orders came down to pull Bong from combat duty and assign him as an instructor. It wasn't a punishment, it was protection. The Army wanted its best ace alive, not shot down over some forgotten island. Bong obeyed, but his heart wasn't in it. "I feel like I'm cheating my buddies," he confessed to a fellow officer. "They're still out there and I'm sitting safe." But duty came in many forms, and now his duty was to teach the next generation how to survive. He approached that task with the same discipline he brought to combat, demanding precision, courage, and calm from every pilot he trained. Even as he trained others, he couldn't resist testing himself. When his superiors weren't watching, Bong would volunteer for weather flights or escort practice runs that somehow turned into real combat encounters. He couldn't help it. The air was his element, the danger, his calling. He didn't chase glory, he chased purpose. By mid-1944, with 40 confirmed kills to his name, Bong had become immortal. No other American pilot in World War II would ever surpass his record. General Douglas MacArthur presented him with the Medal of Honor, praising his unmatched skill and valor. Bong stood stiffly, uncomfortable with the attention. When reporters asked what the medal meant to him, he said, "It means I did my job." That humility resonated deeply with the public. To millions, he wasn't just a hero, he was a reflection of themselves, an ordinary man who rose to greatness because he refused to back down. Yet beneath the acclaim, Bong remained human. He felt fear, loss, exhaustion. He saw comrades fall and planes vanish in fire. He dreamed of home, of peace, of life after the war. His letters to Marge grew more tender, more wistful. "When this is over," he wrote, "I don't want medals or parades. I just want to sit with you and watch the sunset." Those words, simple and sincere, reveal the heart behind the legend. A man who longed not for fame, but for quiet. And when the war did end, he seemed poised for a new beginning. The future of aviation was changing, and Bong was ready to be part of it. But fate, as ever, had its own plans. The tragic irony of his death, on the very day humanity stepped into the nuclear age, cemented him forever as a figure of transition, standing between the past and the future. The propeller and the jet, the human and the machine, the simplicity of courage and the complexity of progress. Richard Bong's story remains one of contrasts: the farm and the battlefield, the ordinary and the extraordinary, the humble heart and the unstoppable will. He lived fast, flew fearlessly, and left behind a legacy that time cannot erode. His impossible trick, that blend of patience, courage, and precision, was more than a tactic. It was a metaphor for life itself: to face your fears head-on, to hold steady until the perfect moment, and to never flinch when the world comes rushing toward you. When people think of Richard Bong today, they often see the medals, the numbers, the headlines, 40 kills, the ace of aces, the Medal of Honor. But behind all of that was a human story, quieter and deeper than the records suggest. It was a story about a young man who never stopped being a farm boy at heart, who carried his small-town values into the chaos of war and somehow held on to them until the end. It was a story about instinct and courage, yes, but also about kindness, humility, and a quiet strength that never sought attention. Bong's life was proof that greatness doesn't come from ego. It comes from purpose. After he was grounded from combat, Bong didn't fade into the background. If anything, he became even more important to the war effort. As an instructor and role model, he shaped the next generation of fighter pilots. He knew firsthand what fear could do in the sky, how it could paralyze, confuse, or push a man into mistakes. So, when he trained young aviators, he didn't just teach them to fly, he taught them to think. "Don't chase the fight," he told them. "Let the fight come to you. Patience wins in the air." To those around him, his calmness was almost eerie. Even when explosions thundered nearby or new recruits panicked during drills, Bong's tone never changed. "Relax," he'd say over the radio, his voice steady as a heartbeat. "You're still flying. Just keep flying." That assurance, that quiet belief that control could overcome chaos, stuck with every pilot who learned under him. Years later, some of those same men would tell their own students, "If you ever lose your head in a fight, remember what Bong said. Keep flying." He also taught by example. During one training exercise, a young pilot miscalculated his landing and came down too fast, his plane bouncing dangerously on the runway. Before anyone else could react, Bong jumped into another aircraft and took off, circling to guide the nervous student back down. He talked him through every move, calm as ever. "Easy now. You've got it. Keep your wings level." The student landed safely on the second try. When he stepped out, shaken but alive, Bong simply clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Now you've learned something no manual can teach." His approach to leadership was rare in wartime. He didn't yell, he didn't demand, he inspired. His crew loved him for that, not because he was soft, but because he was fair. He believed that respect had to be earned, not enforced. When mechanics worked through the night to keep his P-38s airworthy, Bong thanked each of them personally, sometimes bringing them coffee or helping clean the aircraft himself. "She's as much yours as mine," he'd say. To him, every part of the mission mattered, from the man who tightened the bolts to the one who pulled the trigger. As his fame spread back home, Bong found himself thrust into the uncomfortable role of celebrity. Magazines wanted interviews, newspapers wanted photos, and radio shows wanted his voice. He obliged, but it never came naturally. Reporters expected thrilling tales of dogfights and heroics. But Bong downplayed every question. "I just did what anyone else would have done," he'd say. His answers frustrated journalists who wanted drama, but they revealed his truth. He wasn't performing for fame. He was simply living by the values he'd always known: humility, honesty, and hard work. In one famous interview, a reporter asked him, "Captain Bong, what goes through your mind when you're facing a swarm of enemy fighters?" Bong paused, then replied, "Mostly, I just hope my guns don't jam." The room erupted in laughter, but his tone wasn't sarcastic. He genuinely meant it. To him, the key to survival wasn't bravery or luck, it was preparation. He trusted his equipment, his training, and his instincts. But above all, he trusted his composure. He knew panic killed faster than bullets. During his downtime, Bong wasn't the type to seek parties or attention. He preferred quiet evenings, writing letters to Marge or helping younger pilots study their flight manuals. When friends teased him about being too serious, he'd grin and say, "You'd be serious too if you'd seen how close bullets can come to your propeller." Yet, for all his seriousness, he wasn't without humor. His pranks were legendary around base, slipping frogs into a tentmate's boots, replacing sugar with salt at breakfast, or scribbling silly doodles on the squadron chalkboard. "He kept us laughing," one comrade said. "Even when the war was trying to kill us, he made sure we remembered how to smile." As Bong's fame grew, so did his correspondence with fans. Letters poured in from across the country, children sending drawings of airplanes, mothers thanking him for protecting their sons, veterans sharing stories of service. Bong tried to answer as many as he could. His responses were always warm and personal. To one little boy who asked how to become a pilot, Bong wrote, "Start by doing your chores right. If you can take care of the things on the ground, the sky will come later." It was simple advice, but it carried his entire philosophy: discipline first, dreams second. When the war finally began to shift in the Allies' favor, Bong's superiors urged him to step back from active duty for good. They wanted to preserve their national hero, the smiling face of American victory. But Bong struggled with that idea. He didn't see himself as a mascot. He saw himself as a pilot. He missed the sound of engines at full throttle, the rush of adrenaline as he broke through the clouds. Ground life felt too quiet, too slow. So when the opportunity came to test America's first operational jet fighter, he saw it as a new challenge, one last chance to fly into the future. The Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star was unlike anything Bong had ever flown. Sleek, silver, and powered by a roaring jet engine, it represented the next leap in aviation. It was faster than any propeller plane, capable of climbing higher and moving smoother, but it was also unpredictable. Jet engines were still experimental, temperamental, prone to sudden failure. For Bong, that only added to the allure. He'd spent his life mastering machines that others thought impossible. This would be no different. Test flying, however, was as dangerous as combat, if not more. There were no enemy bullets, but there were unknowns. Every flight could reveal a flaw that might prove fatal. Bong knew the risks. He discussed them with Marge before accepting the assignment. She worried, of course. "Haven't you done enough flying for one lifetime?" she asked him. Bong smiled gently. "Maybe," he said, "but someone has to make sure the next ones are safe." That sense of duty, not to glory but to progress, was what defined him. His colleagues at Lockheed admired his professionalism. Unlike some pilots who chased records or publicity, Bong treated each test with scientific precision. He filled notebooks with observations, calculating airflow, engine temperature, and response times. He wasn't just flying, one engineer said. He was learning. His humility never faded. Despite being a war hero, he never pulled rank, never acted superior. He was just Dick to everyone, approachable, helpful, and endlessly curious. In those final weeks of his life, he seemed content. Married to Marge, living in California, and contributing to aviation's future, he was at peace in a way he hadn't been during the war. He'd done his duty, earned his honors, and survived where so many hadn't. He talked about starting a family, maybe buying a small farm one day, building a life far from headlines and danger. "I just want to grow old," he told a friend. "That would be the real miracle." No one could have known how short that dream would be. On that fateful morning of August 6, 1945, Bong's calm routine, the same steady pattern he'd followed countless times, would end in tragedy. As he taxied down the runway, the air was still, the sun bright. He checked his instruments, adjusted his helmet, and gave a small wave to the ground crew. Then the P-80 roared to life, streaking down the strip and lifting gracefully into the blue. For a few brief seconds, everything was perfect. Man and machine in harmony, as always. Then came the failure. The engine sputtered, then choked. Smoke poured from the exhaust. Bong tried to climb for altitude to eject safely, but the plane was too low, too heavy, its new engine unpredictable. He pulled the canopy release. Nothing. The ground rushed up. In an instant, the sky that had given him everything took him back. News of his death spread like wildfire. For many, it didn't seem real. America's greatest ace, gone, not in war, but in peace. Flags flew at half-mast. Newspapers across the nation carried his photo, side by side with the headline announcing Hiroshima. The irony was staggering. As the world entered a new age of power, it lost one of the few men who had mastered the old one. Those who knew him grieved not just for the pilot, but for the man. "He wasn't just a hero," said one of his commanders. "He was the kind of man we all wanted to be." Marge, heartbroken, chose to honor his memory quietly. She refused to remarry, dedicating much of her life to preserving his legacy. To her, he was never the ace of aces, just Dick, the kind soul who wrote her letters from halfway across the world and called her picture his good luck charm. In the days following Richard Bong's death, America seemed to stand still for a moment. The nation was celebrating victory over Japan, and yet, amid the parades and the tears of relief, there was a quiet undercurrent of mourning. It was as though the war's final act had demanded one more sacrifice, not on the battlefield, but from the man who symbolized the very best of those who had fought it. Newspapers carried his photograph on the front page, a young face framed by a pilot's helmet, smiling modestly as if unaware of his own legend. For many Americans, it was a reminder that even triumph can carry sorrow. In his hometown of Poplar, Wisconsin, the news hit like a thunderclap. Neighbors gathered on porches, radios crackling with bulletins from faraway California. Some wept openly, others simply sat in silence. For them, Bong wasn't just a national hero, he was their boy. The kid who'd fixed fences, waved from his bicycle, and helped stack hay in the summer sun. The local church bell tolled for him that evening, and people came from miles around to pay their respects. They left flowers at the steps of his family's farmhouse, notes tucked between them. "Thank you for what you did. We're proud of you. Godspeed." His parents, Carl and Dora Bong, received condolence telegrams from generals, congressmen, and even the president. But the one that meant the most came from one of Richard's old flight instructors. It read simply, "He never stopped climbing." Dora held on to that telegram for the rest of her life, keeping it folded neatly in her Bible. When the funeral was held, it drew more people than the small town had ever seen. Soldiers in crisp uniforms stood beside farmers in overalls, all united in grief and pride. The local high school band played a solemn rendition of "America the Beautiful." Veterans who had served with him spoke softly about his courage, his humor, and his humanity. One of them, choking back tears, said, "He made it look easy, but it never was." As the honor guard fired their final salute, the echo rolled across the fields like distant thunder, the same sound Bong had once followed to the skies. After the war, America moved on quickly, as it always does. The world was rebuilding, technology was advancing, and the memories of battle slowly faded into history books. Yet Richard Bong's name refused to fade. His legacy endured in ways that surprised even those closest to him. Schools were named after him, highways bore his name, and his story became a staple of aviation history. The Bong Veterans Historical Center, built decades later in Superior, Wisconsin, became a shrine not to his death, but to his life, to the farm boy who taught the world that courage doesn't need to shout. Visitors who walk through the museum today can see his medals, his uniforms, and fragments of his beloved P-38 Lightning. There's a replica of the nose art that once carried Marge's smiling face, the same image that watched over him in battle. People linger before it, imagining the moments before takeoff, the steady hum of engines, the smell of fuel, the quiet breath he must have taken before pushing the throttle forward. For those who stand there long enough, the distinction between legend and man begins to blur. You start to feel that maybe he's still out there somewhere, looping through clouds, tracing the edges of eternity. Even the Japanese, who once viewed him as a mortal enemy, came to respect his skill and honor. Post-war accounts from surviving Zero pilots revealed that Bong's name had been known among them, whispered in briefings, spoken with both fear and admiration. They called him the Silver Ghost for the way his twin-tailed P-38 would appear, suddenly from the sun, strike with impossible precision, and vanish again. To them, he wasn't a faceless foe. He was a worthy adversary who embodied the best of the warrior's spirit. Historians have often tried to analyze what made Bong different. Was it raw talent? Was it nerve? Was it luck? The answer lies in a combination of all three, but more than that, it was his mindset. He didn't fly for glory, he flew for purpose. Every mission had meaning, every action intent. He was methodical but fearless, confident but never arrogant. He trusted his instincts the way a farmer trusts the seasons, with quiet certainty born from experience. When asked once what separated good pilots from great ones, he replied, "Great ones know when not to fight." It was a simple truth, but a profound one. In a world that often equated courage with recklessness, Bong understood that real bravery was measured in judgment, not just daring. As America entered the post-war boom, Bong's legend took on a mythic quality. He became part of the national narrative, a story parents told their children about what it meant to be brave, humble, and true. For the pilots of the new jet age, he was a standard. His portrait hung in flight schools, and his name appeared in manuals and lectures. Even as planes evolved from piston engines to supersonic speeds, his principles remained timeless. Get close, stay calm, shoot straight became not just a tactic but a philosophy of mastery, applicable far beyond the cockpit. In Wisconsin, the Bong family did their best to return to normal life, though normal would never quite come. His parents continued working the farm, finding comfort in the routines their son had once shared. Marge, meanwhile, carried his memory quietly through the years. She became a writer and educator, sharing his story when asked, but never exploiting it. "He wasn't larger than life," she said once in an interview. "He was life, kind, curious, stubborn, and full of heart." Her love for him never faded. When she passed away decades later, she was buried beside him, the two reunited at last. The P-38 Lightning, Bong's beloved aircraft, eventually became a symbol of the era he defined. The sound of its twin engines, once the terror of enemy pilots, now stirs nostalgia in air shows and museums. To see one in flight today, sleek, silver, cutting through the air with grace, is to glimpse a fragment of the world he ruled. Many veterans who served under Bong's command have described watching one of those restored Lightnings take off and feeling something indescribable. "That's him," one said softly. "That's Dick." The deeper meaning of his life extends beyond aviation. It's about the power of focus, the belief that mastery isn't born of arrogance, but of discipline. It's about courage, not as loud defiance, but as quiet conviction. And it's about humility, the rare kind that doesn't diminish greatness, but defines it. Bong's story reminds us that heroism doesn't always look like what movies show us. Sometimes it looks like a quiet young man who fixes engines by lantern light, dreams about clouds, and risks his life without ever thinking himself special. There's an almost poetic symmetry to his life and death, a rise that began with curiosity and ended in the very frontier he helped create. In that sense, Bong was both a symbol of the past and a bridge to the future. He belonged to an era when the bond between man and machine was intimate, when skill and instinct were the difference between life and death. And yet, his final act, testing the jet that would define the modern age, placed him firmly in the lineage of pioneers. His story closes one chapter of history and opens another. Today, if you visit Poplar, you'll find that the people still talk about him as if he never left. His childhood home is preserved, and every August a small ceremony is held in his honor. Local kids learn about him in school, just as their grandparents once did. Some even ride their bikes to the Bong Veterans Center, staring up at the gleaming model of his plane suspended from the ceiling, imagining what it must have been like to take off into a sky filled with danger and promise. The legacy of Richard Bong isn't just measured in kills or medals. It's measured in the countless lives he inspired, the pilots who followed his example, the families who found hope in his courage, the generations who learned from his story that greatness doesn't come from being extraordinary. It comes from doing the ordinary things with extraordinary heart. The real, impossible trick was never about flying too close or shooting too straight. It was about living with balance, between daring and humility, skill and kindness, ambition and gratitude. If history teaches us anything, it's that time tends to turn men into myths, But some figures resist that transformation. They remain human, relatable, real. Richard Bong is one of them. His legend endures not because he was perfect, but because he wasn't. He doubted, he feared, he laughed, he loved. And yet, in every test, he rose, not above others, but above himself. And maybe that's why his story still matters. Because in the end, Richard Bong's life reminds us that the sky has no limit for those who have the courage to climb. In every era of human progress, there are figures who capture not just the achievements of their time, but the very essence of their generation, people whose lives become metaphors for the spirit of an age. For America in the 1940s, Richard Ira Bong was one of those figures. He represented the courage of ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances, the innovation born of necessity, and the humility that kept heroism grounded in humanity. His story wasn't one of privilege or opportunity, it was one of grit, timing, and unshakable resolve. Long after the war, when aviation historians and military scholars studied the tactics of World War II, Bong's name came up again and again. His flying style defied conventional logic, close-range marksmanship, precise bursts, patient hunting. The impossible trick that defined his combat approach became an enduring lesson in aerial warfare. Modern pilots, even in the jet and digital age, still study his gun camera footage, analyzing the economy of his movements, the way he aligned his shots, how he conserved ammunition while achieving devastating accuracy. His approach wasn't reckless, it was calculated perfection. But what truly set him apart wasn't his flying. It was his temperament. Many pilots described the intensity of air combat as something that either sharpened a man's instincts or broke his nerves completely. The sky could make heroes or ghosts within seconds. In that chaos, Bong's mind stayed clear. While others panicked when the tracers whizzed past or engines caught fire, Bong thought only in solutions: altitude, throttle, angle, escape. He once told a young pilot, "If you panic, you're already dead. If you think, you might live." Those words, simple as they were, became something of a mantra for generations of flyers who followed him. His ability to remain calm wasn't born of fearlessness, but of acceptance. He knew the risks every time he climbed into the cockpit. He knew death wasn't an abstraction. He had seen it, heard it, and flown through it. But he accepted it as part of the job, the same way a farmer accepts that storms will come. It wasn't about denying danger, it was about respecting it. In that sense, Bong's composure was spiritual as much as tactical. He flew with the serenity of someone who had made peace with the sky long before the war began. When his commanders first noticed how many Japanese aircraft he was downing, they thought he must be exaggerating. 40 confirmed kills was an almost unthinkable number. Most pilots were lucky to survive 10 missions, let alone claim victories. But Bong's records held up under scrutiny. Each kill was verified by witnesses, gun footage, or crash confirmation. There was no luck about it, just skill, nerve, and extraordinary control. The Japanese came to know his twin-boomed plane like a signature. Whenever they saw the glint of its silver fuselage cutting through sunlight, they braced for an attack that almost always ended in their defeat. And yet, for all the fame, Bong never let ego consume him. The more people called him a hero, the more he deflected the praise. He didn't like ceremonies, hated making speeches, and often dodged interviews if he could. When he did speak, his words were quiet, sincere, and a little awkward. "I'm just doing what I was trained to do," he'd tell reporters. "The real heroes are the guys who don't come back." That humility made him beloved not only by his peers, but also by a war-weary public, desperate for a symbol of decency amid destruction. At a time when propaganda celebrated aggression and dominance, Bong embodied something gentler: the idea that courage could coexist with kindness. He didn't relish killing. He never bragged about victories. To him, shooting down an enemy plane wasn't a triumph, it was a necessity. Every pull of the trigger was done with precision, not vengeance. His letters home often reflected this tension. In one, he wrote to Marge, "Sometimes I think about the faces on the other side. They have families too. But if I hesitate, I won't be coming home to you. So I fly, and I try not to think too much." That kind of honesty revealed a deeper truth about Bong. He wasn't hardened by war. He endured it, survived it, and somehow managed to retain his humanity through it all. His friends said that even after returning from combat, he could shift instantly from pilot to farm boy, trading stories of dogfights one minute and asking about the corn harvest the next. His roots grounded him, literally and figuratively. The boy who once dreamed of touching the sky never lost sight of the earth that raised him. After his death, psychologists studying the behavior of elite pilots coined a term to describe his rare blend of calm and control: Bong's balance. It referred to the equilibrium between aggression and restraint, action and patience, courage and caution. The concept became a model for leadership training, not just in aviation, but across the military. They taught that Bong's balance wasn't just about flying, it was about living, knowing when to push forward, when to hold back, and how to stay steady under pressure. That principle resonated far beyond the cockpit. Business leaders, educators, and even athletes began quoting him. "Get close, then act," became shorthand for precision under stress, a reminder that success favors those who think deeply before striking. Bong's legend evolved into a philosophy of excellence itself. Back home, the Bong family remained humble despite the constant attention. They didn't seek fame or recognition, though they received both. When the state of Wisconsin named a major highway after him, the Richard I Bong Memorial Bridge, his father attended the dedication quietly, hands folded, eyes moist. He told a reporter afterward, "I wish he'd lived long enough to drive over it himself." That bridge, spanning the waters between Superior, Wisconsin and Duluth, Minnesota, stands today as both a literal and symbolic link between the past and the future, between ordinary life and the extraordinary heights one man reached. At the Bong Veterans Historical Center, there's a display featuring his logbook, the same one he carried throughout the war. The pages are worn, the ink faded, but the details are precise. Each entry tells a story. Takeoff times, weather conditions, altitude, and notes like "enemy engaged, no damage sustained." What's striking isn't the numbers, but the tone, calm, methodical, almost clinical. There's no bravado, no self-congratulation, just a man recording his work. The handwriting of a farm boy who treated even the most harrowing missions with the discipline of a craftsman. For visitors standing before that glass case, it's easy to imagine him hunched over that notebook by lantern light, the Pacific night air thick around him, writing carefully while others slept or celebrated. It's a portrait of the real Bong, not the mythic ace of aces, but the quiet worker of miracles, the man who made the impossible look routine because he never stopped improving. Today, his legacy continues to inspire not only pilots, but anyone chasing a dream that seems out of reach. The idea that an ordinary farm boy could rise to mastery through persistence and heart has become part of America's cultural DNA. Teachers use his story to remind students that discipline matters more than talent. Military academies cite his humility as the mark of true leadership, and aviators, young and old, still speak his name before takeoff, a ritual of respect for the man who proved that limits are just the edges of fear waiting to be crossed. And yet, for all the monuments and medals, perhaps the greatest tribute to Richard Bong is something quieter. It's the feeling people get when they look up into a clear blue sky, that stirring mix of wonder, longing, and courage. The same feeling Bong must have had as a boy standing in a Wisconsin field, watching a plane streak across the heavens and thinking, "One day, that'll be me." He never stopped chasing that sky, and though his life ended too soon, his climb never really ceased. It continued in every young pilot he trained, in every aircraft that took to the air because of lessons he helped shape, in every dreamer who believes that courage is not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. In the quiet moments when the world feels too heavy and the odds too great, his story whispers across time. Get close, stay steady, don't flinch. That's how he lived. That's how he flew. And that's why, decades later, his wings have never stopped casting their shadow across the sky. The legend of Richard Bong doesn't end with his final flight. In many ways, it begins there, in the way his story took on a life of its own, growing from the memories of those who knew him into something far larger than one man's lifetime. His death may have closed one chapter, but his spirit continued to soar in the decades that followed. Generations who never saw a P-38 Lightning in the sky would still come to know his name, his smile, and his story, the tale of a humble farm boy whose courage defied logic, whose skill transcended fear, and whose humanity set him apart from every hero of his time. After the war, as America transitioned into an age of peace and prosperity, The country needed stories like his, reminders of what the nation had endured and what it stood for. Bong became a symbol of that balance between strength and humility. To school children learning about World War II, he wasn't just a name in a textbook. He was a flesh and blood example that greatness could be born in barns and pastures, not just in cities or military academies. His story told them that you didn't need to be extraordinary to do something extraordinary. You just needed to keep going when others stopped. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, his legend continued to grow through books, documentaries, and newspaper retrospectives. Veterans who had served beside him shared their memories with a reverence normally reserved for saints. They spoke of his quiet humor, his sharp eyes, his ability to make split-second decisions that saved lives. One recalled, "When Bong flew, you could feel it. The air changed. The rest of us were flying planes. He was flying art." Another said, "He didn't fly against the enemy. He flew through them." Their words painted a picture not of invincibility, but of mastery, the kind that comes from total trust in one's purpose. In aviation circles, Bong's tactics became the stuff of study. Fighter schools recreated his maneuvers in training simulations, teaching cadets the same principles he lived by: patience, precision, and nerve. His philosophy, to get close before firing, wasn't just a matter of bravery. It was a tactical revolution. By closing distance, he eliminated the guesswork that led to wasted ammunition and missed shots. It demanded both skill and self-control. You had to resist the instinct to panic. You had to wait until the right moment, even when that moment seemed too late. He didn't win with luck, one historian wrote. He won with discipline. But beyond the strategy and statistics, there was something profoundly human about Bong's story that resonated deeply with people. He represented an ideal that transcended war, the notion that courage is quiet, that heroes don't need to announce themselves, and that the greatest strength often hides behind humility. In an era when many sought fame, Bong avoided it. He never used his reputation to enrich himself. He never cashed in on his fame through politics or endorsements. He simply wanted to fly. That purity made him timeless. He belonged not to an era, but to an ideal. His home state of Wisconsin, proud of its native son, made sure his memory would never fade. In Poplar, the road leading to his childhood farm was renamed Bong Boulevard. Schools adopted his name, and every generation of students learned about the boy who once chased airplanes with his eyes and later became the most skilled pilot in American history. Teachers used his story to inspire perseverance. If a farm boy could master the skies, there was no dream beyond reach. The Richard the Bong Veterans Historical Center, built decades later near Lake Superior, became not just a museum, but a sanctuary. Inside, glass cases gleamed with artifacts: his leather flight jacket, his flight log, his medals, even the faintly yellowed letters he wrote to Marge. Visitors could read them in his own handwriting, the words simple and tender. "I miss you more than the stars miss the night," he wrote in one. "When this is over, I'll take you flying. We'll chase the clouds together." Those letters capture something that history books often forget: that behind every act of courage is a beating heart, longing for peace. Outside the museum stands a full-scale replica of his P-38 Lightning, silver and sharp against the blue sky. The nose bears Marge's name and image, just as it did during the war. When the sun hits it, the metal glows like liquid fire, as if the plane is ready to take off again. Each year, veterans, families, and tourists gather beneath it for memorial services. They tell stories, share laughter, and sometimes tears. And when the bugle sounds its final note of taps, the crowd falls silent, heads tilted upward, watching the empty sky that once carried their hero. Even beyond America, Bong's influence spread. Allied pilots from Britain and Australia cited his example in their own training programs. His techniques became universal, lessons in patience and timing that transcended language and nationality. In Japan, former adversaries who survived the war spoke his name with respect. One veteran pilot, interviewed in the 1980s, said through a translator, "He was a master of the sky. We feared him, but we honored him. He was fair. He fought with skill, not hatred." It was the ultimate tribute: respect from those who once sought to destroy him. What made Bong truly exceptional was that he never lost sight of who he was. He could have been hardened by combat, but he never let war change his nature. Friends often remarked that he didn't carry the burden of arrogance or bitterness that so many aces did. "He never believed he was special," one of his comrades recalled. He just believed he had a job to do and that he'd better do it right. That simple ethic, do the job right, was the quiet engine that powered his greatness. There's something deeply poetic about how his life intertwined with the evolution of flight itself. When he was born, airplanes were fragile things made of wood and canvas. By the time he died, they were sleek machines powered by jet engines capable of piercing the sound barrier. Bong lived in the brief, brilliant window between those two worlds, when flying was still as much art as science, when the bond between man and machine was almost spiritual. He embodied that era perfectly, disciplined yet daring, grounded yet limitless. In the decades since, his name has become a touchstone for aviators and dreamers alike. Test pilots quote him before their first flights. Cadets write essays about his courage. Every year, air shows across the Midwest dedicate a moment of silence in his honor, the engines of vintage P-38s rumbling in tribute. The sound of those engines, deep, rhythmic, defiant, echoes through the air like a heartbeat that refuses to stop. Even those outside the world of aviation find inspiration in his story. To the ordinary worker, he represents dedication, to the student, perseverance, to the soldier, courage, to the dreamer, hope. His life is proof that heroism doesn't demand perfection. It demands persistence, the will to keep climbing no matter how heavy the air becomes. The older generation who knew him has mostly passed now, but his memory continues to ripple forward. Teachers still tell his story. Parents still bring their children to see his plane. His hometown still holds its annual commemoration every August. And every so often, on a clear day, a single plane flies low over the fields of poplar, tipping its wings in salute, a tradition known simply as Bong's Pass. The people below stop what they're doing, look up, and smile. For a moment, it's as if time bends, the farm boy and the sky meeting once more. In the end, that's what his legacy truly is. Not the number 40, not the medals or accolades, but the connection he forged between courage and grace. He showed that it's possible to be both fierce and kind, both relentless and gentle. He proved that real strength isn't loud, it's steady, and that even the simplest beginnings can lead to the highest heights. Richard Bong's story remains a beacon in the vast tapestry of history, a reminder that heroes don't emerge from destiny. They emerge from character. And though his wings were stilled far too soon, his flight never ended. Every time someone dares to face the impossible and refuses to flinch, his spirit soars again, silent, bright, and eternal above the world he loved. Years after the war, when the roar of propellers had faded and the world had moved on to jets and rockets, the name Richard Bong still carried a special kind of electricity. It wasn't about nostalgia for war, or even fascination with his skill as a pilot. It was something deeper. His story resonated because it was honest. It wasn't polished or exaggerated. It was a simple truth about a young man who gave everything he had to something he believed in. People admired his bravery, yes, but they loved his humility more. In a century that often celebrated loud ambition, Bong was proof that greatness could speak softly. By the 1950s, aviation was changing faster than anyone could have imagined. The Cold War had begun, and the skies were now dominated by sleek jets capable of speeds Bong had only dreamed of. But even in that new era of technology, his example remained relevant. Pilots training for jet combat still heard his name during classroom briefings. They studied his tactics, his disciplined patience, his precision marksmanship, and his refusal to let emotion dictate action. Many instructors kept a photo of him pinned to the wall. Beneath it, they wrote the same words that had defined his combat philosophy. Get close, stay calm, make it count. To the new generation of aviators, Bong was more than a historical figure. He was a mentor across time. His methods, developed through experience and intuition, still applied in the age of radar and guided missiles. His approach to air combat was rooted not in aggression, but in control. The man who panics first dies first, he once said. That single line became a cornerstone of fighter-pilot psychology. Even today, modern Air Force training echoes his lesson. Composure wins battles long before the trigger is pulled. What made Bong's example timeless wasn't just his skill, it was his humanity. So many wartime heroes, celebrated for their ferocity or daring, faded from memory because their stories lacked warmth. Bong's story endured because it had heart. He wasn't a mythic warrior, He was an everyman who happened to be extraordinary at what he did. His letters home showed vulnerability. His jokes, often self-deprecating, revealed humility. And his love for Marge, painted on his plane's nose, carried in every mission, gave his legend a tenderness that no battlefield could erase. It's almost poetic how his personal and professional lives intertwined through that image of Marge painted on his lightning. To his squad mates, it was more than decoration. It was a symbol. It reminded them that behind every mission, every dogfight, every flash of tracer fire, there were people waiting back home. Families, sweethearts, lives that mattered. Bong carried that reminder into every flight, and maybe that's part of what kept him grounded. Even as he soared higher than anyone else, he never lost sight of what was below him, the world he was fighting to protect. Marge herself became something of an icon in the years after his death. She was the living link to his story, the proof that his legend wasn't just built on wartime propaganda, but on real love, real loss, and real devotion. She once said in an interview decades later, "I don't think he ever thought of himself as famous. He just wanted to do things right." That was Dick. Her voice cracked when she said it, and you could hear the years of longing between every word. She never remarried. For her, the man who flew with her face on his plane never really left. "He's still out there," she said once, looking at the sky. "He's just flying higher, now." The more people learned about Bong's life, the more they realized his story wasn't about war at all. It was about mastery. He had taken the things that made him great, patience, precision, and humility, and applied them to everything he touched. Whether it was fixing a tractor as a boy, teaching a young pilot as an officer, or testing a new aircraft as a pioneer, he approached each task with the same quiet determination. Do it right, or don't do it at all. That mindset, carried from the farm to the battlefield, became the invisible thread connecting every chapter of his life. Even the way Bong viewed death reflected his clarity of thought. Friends recalled that he wasn't afraid of dying. He simply didn't want to waste the life he'd been given. When someone asked him, early in the war, if he feared never coming home, he answered, "I don't think about dying. I think about flying well. If I do that, everything else will take care of itself." There was no bravado in his tone. It was practical wisdom, the kind that comes from someone who understood the power of focus. In the years after his death, Bong became part of a cultural memory that transcended military circles. Schools named after him emphasized not just his military achievements, but his character. Teachers told his story as a moral lesson about discipline and courage. His likeness appeared in classroom posters during the 1950s and 60s, alongside Amelia Earhart and Charles Lindbergh, not as an icon of warfare, but as a symbol of perseverance. He reminds us, one educator wrote, that heroes are made in quiet moments of choice, not in the noise of battle. The small town of Poplar never let his spirit fade either. Every summer, children in the local 4-H clubs would visit the Bong Memorial and learn about the young man who had walked the same dusty roads they did. They'd hear how he practiced shooting cans off fence posts, how he fixed broken engines, how he dreamed of flying long before anyone thought it possible. And when they saw the P-38 replica gleaming under the Wisconsin sun, they understood something profound. Greatness doesn't come from where you start. It comes from what you refuse to give up on. His story also lived on through the voices of those he trained. Many of his students went on to become decorated pilots themselves, and they credited him for their survival. One, interviewed in the 1970s, said, "I still hear him in my head. Every time I got into trouble, I'd hear his voice. 'Don't panic. You're still flying.' That voice saved me more than once." That single piece of advice, simple, steady, and true, became the invisible lifeline between generations of aviators. Bong's influence extended even to test pilots and astronauts who came after him. When the space race began, figures like Chuck Yeager and Neil Armstrong often spoke about the lineage of courage and experimentation that paved the way for them. Bong's name appeared among those who dared first, the ones who risked everything not for fame, but for progress. Yeager once mentioned him in an interview, saying, "Guys like Dick Bong made the rest of us believe that limits were meant to be tested." Coming from one pioneer to another, it was perhaps the most fitting tribute imaginable. Over time, Bong's legend became a kind of moral compass in the Air Force. When new cadets struggled or doubted themselves, instructors reminded them of him, the farm boy who faced impossible odds and prevailed through focus and humility. Be like Bong, they'd say, not meaning be perfect, but be steady. It wasn't about the number of planes you could down or how fast you could fly. It was about composure, honor, and effort. Those were the traits that turned a boy into a legend. And so, while history has no shortage of heroes, few carry the same balance of strength and simplicity that Bong did. He didn't need speeches or grand gestures to inspire. His example was enough. Even now, decades later, his story feels relevant. In a world that often prizes noise over substance, his quiet excellence is a reminder that real mastery speaks softly but lasts forever. If you stand today near the Bong Memorial Bridge in Superior, you can hear the wind rushing across the water, whistling through the steel beams like the faint hum of engines. It's almost as if the sound itself carries his memory. The whisper of a plane slicing through air, the steady pulse of determination that once changed the course of a war. Every gust feels like a salute, every ray of sunlight a reminder that courage never fades. Somewhere in that sky, beyond the reach of clouds and history, the spirit of Richard Bong is still flying, calm, focused, and utterly free. The years rolled on, and with them came new wars, new heroes, and new technologies that pushed human flight into realms Richard Bong could never have imagined. Jets broke the sound barrier, rockets reached the edge of space, and satellites began to orbit the Earth. Yet through all those advancements, his story remained, quietly but powerfully, as a reminder of where courage begins. It begins not in power or technology, but in the heart of someone who dares to try the impossible. For Bong, that impossible trick, the one that astonished his peers and terrified his enemies, wasn't just a flight maneuver. It was a philosophy. Get close, he used to say. Get close enough to see his eyes. It was the purest distillation of his belief in precision. He understood that the key to winning wasn't chaos or speed. It was clarity. By closing in, he removed doubt, hesitation, and chance. He replaced them with certainty, and in that certainty lay his power. The move was as much psychological as it was physical. To dive into danger while keeping absolute composure required not just skill, but nerve, the kind that can't be taught, only refined. That philosophy extended far beyond combat. It spoke to his entire approach to life. Whether working on his family's farm, instructing pilots, or testing jets, Bong always got close. He paid attention. He engaged fully. He didn't skim over the surface of things. He immersed himself. That's what made him extraordinary. He wasn't chasing fame or fortune. He was chasing mastery. And that pursuit, the relentless drive to do something as well as it can possibly be done, is what turned him from a farm boy into a legend. Even those who never met him felt his presence through his influence on others. His students, many of whom survived the war because of his training, carried his lessons into their own commands. They passed them down, word for word, to new generations. Fly smart, fly calm, fly true. Those words became part of the Air Force's invisible creed, not written in manuals, but carried in the hearts of those who knew the weight of the sky. One of Bong's most notable qualities was his instinct for adaptation. He never treated experience as a static thing. He learned from every flight, from every mistake, every scare, every victory. If something went wrong, he analyzed it. If something went right, he refined it. His logbooks show that evolution clearly. Notes in the margins, adjustments to technique, reflections on tactics. It wasn't arrogance that made him improve. It was curiosity. The same curiosity that made him take apart engines as a child pushed him to understand flight at its deepest level. His humility, however, remained constant. That's what people admired most. When other aces returned home boasting of their victories, Bong returned quietly, preferring to talk about his friends rather than himself. He sent letters to the families of fallen comrades, offering comfort with sincerity that only someone who had been there could express. He didn't glorify war. He saw it for what it was, necessary, brutal, and costly. But within that storm, he found a purpose that gave it meaning: protecting others. For all his achievements, Bong never lost his gentleness. Pilots who served with him often described how, after missions, he'd sit on the wing of his plane, cigarette in hand, gazing at the horizon in silence. He rarely celebrated his victories. He just seemed thoughtful, perhaps reflecting on what had been gained and what had been lost. In those quiet moments, you could see the farm boy again, the one who loved open skies and honest work. The war had made him famous, but it had never changed who he was. When he died, the loss was felt not only in America, but around the world. The news spread quickly through military bases, airfields, and factories. Many pilots wept openly. "We lost more than a man," one general said. "We lost an idea that courage and kindness could live in the same soul." Yet that idea didn't truly die. It survived in the memories of those who'd known him, and it grew in the stories told by those who came after. By the 1970s, Bong's name had entered the realm of timeless icons, not just for his kills, but for his character. Hollywood tried to capture his story a few times, but every script seemed to fall short. No actor could quite convey the contradiction that made him unique, the quiet man who did impossible things without ever acting like a hero. His story didn't fit the mold of cinematic drama because it wasn't about spectacle, it was about integrity. And integrity doesn't need special effects. Historians often call Bong the last great pure ace, and it's true. After his era, warfare changed. Jet combat made encounters faster, more technical, and less personal. The intimacy of the dogfight, the ability to look into the eyes of your opponent, disappeared. In many ways, Bong's generation was the last to experience the romance and raw humanity of aerial combat. They fought not just with machines, but with willpower, instinct, and emotion. And among them, Bong stood out because he embodied the best of it, the grace, the discipline, the humanity. There's a photograph of him that captures all of this perfectly. It was taken in 1944, shortly after he received the Medal of Honor. He's standing in his flight suit, smiling faintly, eyes calm and unassuming. Behind him, the P-38 Marge gleams in the tropical sun. There's no swagger, no performance, just quiet confidence. You can almost feel the steadiness in him, the sense that he knows exactly who he is and what he's meant to do. It's the face of someone who doesn't chase destiny, but meets it head-on. In his hometown today, that same image greets visitors at the Bong Heritage Center. Children stare up at it in awe, trying to imagine what it must have felt like to sit in that cockpit, to fly into danger again and again, and still come home with a smile. Teachers tell them, he wasn't born brave, he learned to be brave. And that's the truth of his legacy. Bong's courage wasn't magic. It was built, piece by piece, through years of discipline, humility, and faith. He wasn't fearless, he was deliberate. He wasn't invincible, he was prepared. That's what made him great. That's what made him human. And even now, long after the roar of his P-38 has faded into history, the lessons of his life still echo in the air. In every pilot who takes a deep breath before a dangerous mission, in every mechanic who double-checks their work before sending a plane skyward, in every young dreamer who looks up and believes that anything is possible with hard work and courage. Because Richard Bong didn't just destroy 40 planes, he destroyed 40 reasons to doubt what a single determined person can accomplish. He turned the impossible into routine, not through luck, but through focus. And in doing so, he gave the world something far greater than records or medals. He gave it an example. When we talk about heroes, we often imagine grand gestures and fearless deeds. But Bong's story reminds us that true heroism is quieter. It's in the steady hands, the calm voice, the unwavering belief that doing the right thing, no matter how hard, always matters. He showed that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the mastery of it. If you stand in those fields of poplar at dusk, the wind moving gently through the grass, you can almost hear it. The faint hum of engines, the whisper of wings overhead. The farm boy who once looked up at the sky is still there, somewhere beyond the clouds, reminding the world that even the smallest life can leave the biggest mark. As time continued to pull the world further away from the 1940s, Richard Bong's story remained one of those rare legends that didn't fade with the years. It deepened. Unlike many wartime figures who were remembered only for their statistics or medals, Bong's legacy endured because it carried meaning. It wasn't just about the 40 enemy planes he downed or the medals that glittered on his uniform. It was about the spirit of an ordinary man who found himself in extraordinary circumstances and rose to them with quiet strength. He wasn't the loudest, he wasn't the flashiest, but he was steady, brave, and relentless. And that, people realized, was what heroism truly looked like. In the decades after his death, America underwent transformation after transformation: the jet age, the space race, the computer revolution. Each new frontier seemed to push the memory of the Second World War a little further into the past. And yet, somehow, Richard Bong's name always resurfaced. When new pilots trained in the 1950s and 60s, his story was still taught. When astronauts prepared for space missions, his precision and calmness were cited as examples of how to act when every second could mean life or death. When historians discussed the moral fabric of American heroism, Bong's name was there, standing for courage without arrogance, victory without cruelty. In many ways, Bong represented a kind of hero that's increasingly rare: the humble warrior. He never fought for fame, never sought power. He was a man who believed in doing his duty as perfectly as possible, and then quietly moving on to the next challenge. His confidence didn't come from ego, it came from competence. That's why so many who studied him, psychologists, military strategists, historians, found him fascinating. His secret wasn't luck or bravado, it was mastery, built from thousands of small, deliberate actions done with care. If you look at his surviving flight logs and letters, you can trace the way his mind worked. He wrote about each mission in simple, almost detached terms: altitude, direction, enemy count, ammunition used. There were no flourishes, no grand storytelling. But between those lines, you can feel the intensity of his focus: a man stripping away everything, unnecessary until only the mission remained. He didn't waste time on excuses or fears. He prepared, he executed, he reflected, and then he improved. That rhythm, preparation, execution, reflection, improvement, became his life's pattern, whether flying, teaching, or fixing engines. Perhaps that's why Bong's impossible trick worked where others failed. He wasn't reckless, he was methodical. Flying in close to an enemy plane went against every instinct most pilots had. It felt suicidal, but Bong had tested it, refined it, and trusted it. He understood that in combat the difference between a near miss and a victory was precision. By getting close enough to eliminate uncertainty, he turned danger into advantage. It was risky, yes, but it was also calculated. A decision born not from impulse but from understanding. And that understanding was what made him so deadly and so effective. But while he mastered the art of combat, he never lost sight of the humanity within it. He saw the war for what it was: a necessary evil, not a game or a glory contest. In his letters to Marge, he often confessed that he hated the destruction, even when he knew it had to be done. "It doesn't feel like victory when you see the smoke," he wrote once. "You just hope the next one means the war ends sooner." It was that empathy, even in the midst of chaos, that separated him from the rest. He fought without hate, and that is a kind of courage that goes beyond bullets and engines. After his death, the Air Force made sure that his legacy wasn't just preserved, but lived. Training schools named lecture halls after him. His philosophies were incorporated into leadership programs. In one famous Air Force Academy address, a commander told cadets, "You will meet men with medals. You will meet men with records. But remember Captain Richard Bong, the man who never believed he was special, yet did what no one else could." That line became a touchstone for those learning the meaning of service. Outside of the military, Bong's story took on new life in classrooms and museums. Teachers used him as an example of perseverance and focus. His humble beginnings made his success relatable. He wasn't born into wealth or privilege. He was raised in a small farmhouse in northern Wisconsin, surrounded by chores, tools, and the rhythm of hard labor. Every skill he learned, patience, responsibility, self-reliance, translated directly into his success as a pilot. He knew that if a tool broke, you fixed it. If something went wrong, you didn't complain, you adapted. That farm-born pragmatism became the foundation of his genius in the air. In Poplar, the town where he was born, the memory of Bong became part of the landscape. The road to his childhood home still winds through rolling fields that look much as they did when he was a boy. The farmhouse itself, lovingly preserved, stands as a quiet monument, not grand or ornate, but simple and strong, just like him. Visitors can walk through it and see the small details that shaped his youth: the worn wooden floors, the old tools, the model planes on a shelf. It's a reminder that greatness often begins in the humblest of places. And it's not just nostalgia that keeps his memory alive, it's relevance. His principles are timeless. In a world that often prizes speed over precision and noise over substance, Bong's example cuts through the static. He showed that excellence isn't about doing everything, it's about doing the right things, the right way, every time. He showed that humility isn't weakness, it's strength under control. And he proved that ordinary people, when driven by purpose and integrity, can achieve the impossible. Every August, on the anniversary of his death, veterans and civilians gather to honor him. They tell stories not only of his combat exploits, but of his character. They talk about the time he gave his rations to a younger pilot who forgot his meal, or how he helped mechanics work late into the night to repair damaged planes, even though he didn't have to. They remember the jokes, the smile, the quiet way he carried himself. One man who served under him once said, "If you didn't know he was the best, you'd never guess it by the way he acted. He treated everyone the same, like equals." That humility is what keeps Bong's story from becoming just another war tale. It transforms it into something more universal. His life becomes not just a chronicle of air battles and victories, but a lesson in leadership, discipline, and humanity. In a sense, Richard Bong didn't just conquer the skies, he mastered himself. And that's the hardest victory anyone can achieve. Standing today beneath the replica of his P-38, Marge, glinting in the sun, you can almost feel the echo of that mastery in the air. The plane seems alive, even grounded, its sleek lines humming with the memory of motion. Visitors often describe feeling a strange calm when they see it. Maybe it's because Bong's spirit, that steady, fearless energy, still lingers there. Maybe it's because people can sense that this wasn't a man chasing glory. It was a man living his purpose. And perhaps that's why his story continues to matter, because it tells us something eternal about the human spirit. It reminds us that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the quiet confidence to take the next step, the patience to wait for the right moment, and the determination to hold steady when everything around you is chaos. Bong lived by that creed, and in doing so, he didn't just change history, he defined what it means to be truly brave. In the years that followed his passing, Richard Bong became more than just a historical figure. He became an emblem of integrity and excellence that outlived the era of propeller-driven planes. His story, retold in classrooms, documentaries, and memorials, carried the same timeless message: that greatness is born not from privilege or bravado, but from humility, discipline, and heart. As generations changed, the image of the farm boy ace remained a constant reminder of what kind of spirit builds heroes. It's almost strange to think that someone who lived such a short life, only 24 years, could leave such a deep and lasting mark on the world. 24 years is barely enough time for most people to find their footing in life, yet Bong used every moment he had with purpose. It wasn't as though he rushed through life, either. He lived deliberately with a sense of focus that made every year count. He wasn't chasing fame, or even consciously shaping a legacy. He was simply doing what he loved, as well and as honorably as he could. That's why his story doesn't feel tragic so much as profound. He didn't die unfinished. He died complete. A man who had already given everything he could to the world. What makes Bong's story so emotionally resonant is how human it is. There was no grand destiny laid out for him. He wasn't chosen by circumstance or born into a life of opportunity. His early years were full of ordinary moments: milking cows, fixing fences, trudging through snow to school, tinkering with engines in a dusty shed. But in those small, quiet hours, the foundations of his greatness were built. Hard work wasn't something he learned in the military. It was something he was raised on. The same steady hands that repaired farm machinery as a boy would one day guide a P-38 through the most intense air battles of the Pacific. And perhaps that's why his story feels so deeply American. Not in a jingoistic sense, but in the way it captures the idea that greatness can come from anywhere. From any farm, any town, any family. He was living proof that courage and excellence aren't reserved for the elite. They belong to anyone willing to practice, fail, and try again. When his name appeared in newspapers across the country, it wasn't just another war headline. It was a story of possibility, a reminder that even the most unassuming person could rise to extraordinary heights. In the small towns of Wisconsin, Bong's name became almost legendary. Kids would pedal their bicycles down dirt roads pretending to be him, making the sounds of engines with their mouths as they banked and swooped through imaginary skies. Parents told his story not as a tale of war, but as a parable of perseverance. He didn't give up, they'd say. He kept learning until he got it right. In that sense, Bong became a kind of folk hero, a figure who represented the best qualities of ordinary people. As the decades passed, Bong's influence rippled far beyond his home state. In the world of aviation, his methods continued to inspire. Pilots studied his approach, the calm precision, the focus on proximity, the patience to wait for the right moment. Modern fighter. Pilots still reference his 300-foot rule, the idea that you should wait until you're close enough to guarantee a hit before firing. It's a principle that requires discipline and nerves of steel, and it has saved countless lives over the years. Even in an age of missiles and automation, Bong's lessons remain relevant. Technology changes, one Air Force instructor once said, but mindset doesn't. Bong taught us that. Beyond the cockpit, his life offered lessons for anyone facing fear or uncertainty. His calm under pressure, his humility in success, and his refusal to be defined by fame are universal virtues. Business leaders, athletes, and even artists have cited him as an inspiration. They see in him a blueprint for mastery, a man who combined passion with patience, who chased perfection not for recognition but for its own sake. He wasn't trying to be great, one writer observed. He was just trying to be better every day, and that's what made him great. At the Richard Duffer Bong Veterans Historical Center, visitors often linger in front of one display in particular, a framed letter he wrote to his parents during the war. In it, Bong downplays his achievements and instead asks about life back home. How's the farm? How's the weather? Did you finish the new barn roof? It's a simple letter, but it captures something profound about him, that even while living through the chaos of global war, his heart never left home. He never let the world change who he was at the core. That groundedness, that refusal to let fame or fear distort his values, is what made him so respected. Those who met him often spoke of his modesty with a kind of awe. One officer said, "You could sit next to him for hours and never know you were talking to the best pilot in the world. He never made you feel small. He made you feel like you belonged." That quality, the ability to elevate others without diminishing himself, is one of the rarest forms of leadership. Bong led not through authority or intimidation, but through example. His quiet confidence made people believe they could do more than they thought possible. When he transitioned from combat to test pilot duty, he approached it with the same sense of purpose he brought to war. He wanted to help advance aviation safely, to make sure the next generation of aircraft would be even better. Ironically, it was that same sense of duty that cost him his life. The P-80 Shooting Star was one of America's first operational jet fighters, fast, powerful, and still experimental. Bong volunteered to help test it, knowing full well the risks. On August 6, 1945, the same day the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima, his jet malfunctioned shortly after takeoff and crashed. The timing was almost cosmic. As one chapter of the war closed, another, his, ended quietly on American soil. His death hit the nation hard. Newspapers carried headlines like, "America's Ace of Aces dies testing jet," and for many, it symbolized the bittersweet transition from war to peace. The boy who had defended the skies was gone, just as the world was entering a new era of flight, one he had helped make possible. Marge, his beloved fiancée, was devastated. She received the Medal of Honor on his behalf from General MacArthur, but the triumph felt hollow. She would later say, "I was proud of him, but I would have traded every medal for one more day with him." In that moment, Richard Bong became more than a military hero. He became a reminder of the human cost of progress, of how fragile brilliance can be. His story wasn't just about victory, it was about sacrifice. It taught future generations that even the greatest among us are mortal and that every act of courage comes with a price. Yet rather than fading into melancholy, his memory became a source of strength. People looked at Bong's life and saw not tragedy, but fulfillment. He lived fully, loved deeply, and left behind a legacy that continues to uplift others. His death, though sudden, didn't define him. His life did, and that life, when you trace it from its humble beginnings to its extraordinary end, forms a perfect arc, a story not of luck or destiny, but of determination and heart. It's the story of a farm boy who looked up at the sky and decided to reach it, not for glory, but for love of flight, of country, and of excellence itself. The story of Richard Bong doesn't just live in history books, it lives in the air itself. Every time a pilot takes off from a runway, heart pounding, eyes fixed on the horizon, a piece of Bong's spirit is there too. He represents that mix of fear and thrill, courage and calm, that defines flight. To fly, in many ways, is to step into uncertainty, to balance between control and chaos. And Bong mastered that balance better than anyone. It's what made his so-called impossible trick possible, that razor-thin line between risk and precision, between bravery and recklessness. His life continues to be studied not only by military strategists, but also by psychologists, because Bong's mindset was unlike anything typical. He wasn't addicted to adrenaline, nor driven by a need to prove himself. He approached combat like a craftsman, as a job that demanded skill, not emotion. He never viewed himself as a killer or a hero. He viewed himself as a pilot who had a responsibility to do his duty with excellence. In a sense, his genius wasn't in his hands, but in his head. He understood that control of the plane began with control of the mind. That inner discipline was something he cultivated long before the war. Growing up on a farm taught him patience and timing, the rhythm of seasons, the precision of tools, the need for persistence. A farmer can't rush a harvest or ignore a broken machine. Every detail matters. Bong brought that same sensibility to the skies. He tended to his aircraft the way a farmer tends to a field, with care, attention, and respect. It wasn't just a machine to him. It was a partner, an extension of his will. He often said that you had to listen to your plane. If something felt wrong, he trusted that instinct. That connection, mechanical, emotional, and almost spiritual, is what gave him such mastery in the air. The P-38 Lightning, his aircraft of choice, became almost synonymous with his name. It was a twin-engine, twin-boomed marvel of engineering, fast, powerful, and versatile. Many pilots found it difficult to handle, but Bong turned it into an instrument of perfection. He studied its quirks until he knew them better than anyone else. He could sense the exact moment when to roll, when to dive, when to fire. He said once, "If you treat her right, she'll take care of you." That relationship between man and machine was the heart of his success. He didn't dominate the aircraft, he collaborated with it. Every combat report about Bong's missions reads like a dance, precise, fluid, lethal in its grace. His movements in the air weren't just tactical, they were instinctive. He could anticipate his enemy's next move before it happened, not because he was clairvoyant, but because he understood human nature. He knew fear when he saw it. He knew desperation, and he knew how to use both against his opponents. That empathy, that ability to read emotion even in an enemy, was another layer of his brilliance. Yet, for all his skill, Bong was never detached from the reality of what he was doing. He understood the weight of every trigger pull. He never spoke lightly of it. In letters and conversations, he often expressed hope that the war would end soon, that men could stop dying. It's a side of him history sometimes forgets, the compassion beneath the courage. He didn't glorify the destruction, he mourned it. That's why his story feels so human even now. He wasn't hardened by war, he was humbled by it. When Bong returned home to America after his record-breaking missions, he was greeted as a national hero. Crowds cheered, newspapers hailed him as America's ace of aces, and his image appeared in magazines across the country. But Bong never got comfortable with fame. He attended ceremonies because he had to, not because he wanted to. His friends said he was happiest when he could sneak away from the spotlight and visit home, sitting at the kitchen table with his parents, eating simple meals, talking about normal things. That humility was disarming to everyone who met him. In an age of propaganda and glamour, he remained exactly what he had always been, a grounded, genuine man. It was that unchanging nature that made his story timeless. The war had turned boys into soldiers and soldiers into heroes, but very few emerged from it with their humanity intact. Bong did. He could have cashed in on his fame, run for office, or sold his story, but instead, he chose to keep flying, to serve quietly in the new world of test piloting, where danger was even greater, and glory almost non-existent. It was an act of pure dedication. He wasn't chasing headlines, he was chasing progress. The irony of his death, that it came not in combat but in peace, still resonates deeply. On that August morning in 1945, when his P-80 jet malfunctioned, Bong didn't panic. Witnesses said he tried to guide the failing aircraft away from homes before ejecting, ensuring no one else would be harmed. Even in his final moments, he thought of others before himself. That small, final act encapsulated everything he stood for. The news of his passing spread across a nation already reeling from the atomic bomb's detonation in Japan that same day. It was as though two worlds had collided, the old world of personal valor and the new world of impersonal power. Bong's death marked the end of an era when courage was measured in seconds and instincts, not machines and megatons. For many Americans, it felt like a curtain had closed. The farm boy who had fought with skill and grace had given way to a world that would fight with science and shadow. Still, his legacy endured, not as a relic, but as a compass. Every era since has rediscovered Bong's story in its own way. To the post-war generation, he was a reminder of integrity and sacrifice. To the Cold War pilots, he was the embodiment of professionalism under pressure. To modern aviators, he's a legend, proof that even in the chaos of war, there is room for discipline, precision, and heart. Today, his spirit hovers not just over airfields, but in classrooms, museums, and even small-town festivals where people gather to remember him. They celebrate not just what he did, but who he was, the kind of man who reminds us that true greatness doesn't shout. It simply shows up, does the job, and inspires everyone around it. When visitors stand beneath his silver P-38 replica, many say they feel something more than admiration. They feel peace. As if Bong himself is still up there somewhere, watching, steady as ever, his wings stretched across the horizon. And maybe that's where he's always been, in the space between sky and earth, between courage and kindness, between what seems impossible and what a human heart can actually do. Because Richard Bong didn't just fly through the clouds, he became part of them, eternal, bright, and forever free. In the quiet corners of history, some stories never truly end. They just keep echoing through time, finding new hearts to land in. Richard Bong's story is one of those. Long after his death, people continue to talk about him not as a distant legend, but as if he were someone they'd known personally. There was something about him, his humility, his courage, his honesty, that felt familiar, almost intimate. He was the kind of hero people could see themselves in. Not flawless, not superhuman, but steadfast, real, and quietly extraordinary. To his family and to those who grew up in northern Wisconsin, Bong wasn't a myth. He was a son, a friend, a neighbor. They still tell stories about how he used to fix tractors for other farmers without being asked, how he'd stay up late tinkering with engines in the barn, and how his laughter carried across the fields. The same hands that once milked cows would later grip the controls of one of the fastest aircraft in the world. It's a poetic kind of symmetry, the simple life of a farm boy merging seamlessly with the sophisticated skill of an aviator. That's what makes his story feel so timeless. It bridges the ordinary and the extraordinary without ever losing touch with either. Every hero in some way holds up a mirror to the people who remember them. Bong's reflection shows us something rare, that success doesn't demand arrogance, that mastery doesn't require pride, and that even in the fiercest battles, kindness can endure. His story teaches that bravery isn't the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear decide what you'll do. It's the same lesson he lived every time he took off into the unknown, trusting his training, his instincts, and his purpose. In the decades following his death, as America's military evolved, Bong's influence remained woven into its foundation. New generations of pilots carried his spirit into the skies, men and women flying jets faster than sound, navigating technologies he never lived to see, but embodying the same calm discipline that had made him invincible. At Air Force academies, instructors still quote him. At memorials, his name is spoken with reverence, often followed by a pause, as if to acknowledge that there's something about him that words can't quite capture. And beyond the military, his legacy touched the culture in quieter, more human ways. His love story with Marge became a symbol of devotion that outlasted war. She kept his memory alive not through grand gestures, but through grace, attending ceremonies, speaking to schools, writing letters to veterans' families who reached out to her. She carried his name not as a burden, but as a promise. "He belongs to the world now," she once said softly, "but I had him first." Her words are both heartbreaking and beautiful, a reminder that even heroes are, at their core, people who love and are loved. At the Bong Veterans Historical Center, there's a wall of letters and photographs from people all over the world, children, veterans, pilots, dreamers. thanking him for what his story has given them. Some write about courage, others about hope. One letter reads, "I used to think greatness was for other people. Then I learned about Richard Bong." Another says simply, "You taught me to stay calm when everything feels impossible." In that way, Bong continues to do what he always did best, to steady others, to inspire without trying to. It's hard to stand in front of his plane, that gleaming silver P-38 with Marge painted on its nose, and not feel something stir inside. You can almost picture him climbing into the cockpit, adjusting his gloves, checking the gauges, and giving a quick wave before roaring down the runway. There's a sense of anticipation frozen in that image, as if he's always just about to take off again, always on the verge of another mission, another dawn, another impossible flight. And maybe that's the truest way to remember him. Not as a man who died young, but as one who lived fully. He didn't waste time chasing recognition or worrying about how history would see him. He just did his work, with care, with courage, and with quiet faith that if you gave your best to the world, it would mean something. And it did. His example continues to ripple outward, inspiring anyone who has ever looked up at the sky and dared to believe that dreams are worth the risk. In his hometown, they still hold an annual celebration in his honor. Veterans salute, children wave flags, and sometimes a vintage plane flies overhead, performing a slow, graceful roll, the kind Bong used to love. When the engines fade, the crowd always falls silent for a few moments. There's no speech that follows, no fanfare, just stillness. And in that stillness, you can almost hear the whisper of wings, a reminder that the sky still belongs, in part, to him. In the end, Richard Bong's life is more than a story about war or flying. It's a story about what it means to strive, to care, and to give everything to something you believe in. It's about how discipline and compassion can coexist, how humility can be stronger than pride, and how one person's example can lift countless others. He showed the world that even when the odds are impossible, there's always a way forward, if you keep your hands steady and your heart clear. If you were to visit his memorial today, you'd see his name carved in bronze beneath the words Ace of Aces. But if you look closer, what stands out isn't the title. It's the simplicity of the name itself, Richard Ira Bong. No ranks, no slogans, no embellishments. Just a name. Because that's how he lived, unadorned, honest, and real. And maybe that's why his legacy feels so alive even now, because deep down, his story isn't just about flying. It's about being human, about reaching for the sky not for glory, but because something inside you refuses to stay on the ground. So when the sun dips low over the fields of Wisconsin and the wind hums softly through the grass, it's not hard to imagine him there, the farm boy who touched the clouds, still flying, still smiling, still showing the world what's possible when courage meets humility. Richard Bong didn't just destroy 40 enemy planes. He destroyed the idea that ordinary men can't do extraordinary things. And in doing so, he became something greater than a hero. He became a reminder that even the simplest soul with the purest heart can leave a legacy that never lands.